So I'm going to talk about vision. I'm mostly going to read from a paper that I wrote, and but I'll do my best to read it in sort of like a engaged fashion. Okay, I'll do my best. Okay, why don't we just go to the next slide? There he is again, Mr. Kenneth Morris, and there's his great Welsh spelling of his name and pronunciation of his name, which, like Ben, I won't try and pronounce, even though I'm probably the person who should know how to pronounce it, but I don't. Kenneth Morris would probably be an accurate way of pronouncing it. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk about vision, particularly in what he has written called the 3 bases of poetry. Okay, so I'm only really going to go into vision. However, please keep in mind that there is a base in music and style. Okay, let's see, I think so we'll come back to this in a little bit. Okay, so Kenneth Morris asked the question, right, the beginning of his 3 bases of poetry, what is poetry? It's the very first line of his 3 bases of poetry. And he responds, actually, by stating that the divinity in man seeks to get its words spoken unhindered by the mortal part of us, to interfere by the road of language in our affairs that the kingdom of heaven may be established. When the brain mind, as he calls it, is silenced for the time and the passions dormant or banished, each speech then is poetry. So when the indelible similitude of the ocean and its waves cease to be separate, the once perceived diametric opposition between the two dissolves into dynamic aspectual oceanic oneness, or in theosophical terms, when the individual soul has yoked with the greater oversoul, the two become one. It is the oversoul which speaks through the poetic mode and imparts vision and sight of the soul, given according to the soul's own method, in its own accent, not translated into terms of the brain, mind, intellect, logic, or reason. I'd love to be able to go into more detail about this little sort of side note about the term oversoul in relation to Emerson, is a very famous transcendentalist. He has an essay all about that, and I think that's interesting since we're on the topic of poetry and vision, and he was quite the visionary and the poet himself. So it's you might want to look that up again. Anyway, so but what is vision? An optical relationship? There's my hand. Okay, to see? Well, what does it mean to see then, right? If vision relates to the sense of sight, what are the limits of vision? How are people able to see beyond that which is purely within view? So Kenneth Morris divides his 3 bases of poetry into vision, music, and style. His study begins with vision, a theme that runs a thread throughout his own essays, fiction, and poetry, and is the prime point of departure into the fathomless mysteries of poetic expression, and it is the essential mode of creativity. Take, for example, Morris's illuminating explication of the following lines from Milton. This is taken from his 3 bases of poetry. So I will read the short passage from Milton. It's very short. So bring the wraith primrose that forsaken dies, the tuft crow-toe and the pale jessamine, the white pink and the pansy freaked with jet, the glowing violet, the muck rose and the well-attired woodbine, with cowslips wan that hang with the pensive head, and every flower that sad embroidery wears, bid amaranthus all his beauty shed, and daffodillies fill their cups with tears. That's from Lycidius, actually this excerpt from a longer poem of his. I hope I'm saying that correctly. So Morris says about this passage from Milton, which has a lot of references to what? Anybody catch that? Plants. So the primrose, the crow-toe, the jessamine, the violet, the muck rose, the woodbine, the cowslips, the amaranthus, the daffodillies. course, these are not our usual sort of contemporary terms like rose, lily. These are a lot more sort of poetic kind of ways of talking about the flowers, I suppose. But anyway, so keep that in mind. So Morris says about this passage, it rings the knell of nature scene. Nature scene. The clearness of the poet's vision into natural things was going. The sublime symbolic blindness was coming upon him, Milton. His objects and similes make no picture of themselves. The value is altogether in the flame of the Promethean soul that burns up the symbols one by one before they have even had any time to be uttered. So Kenneth Morris tells us here that Milton was able to see beyond the alluring superficiality of the flowers and the foliage. He embodies their deeper meaning within the Promethean soul by the clearness of his vision. His nature scene, and thus the division between the kingdom of humankind and the realm of botanical life, dissolve and burn up into one, before separated by language. A vision limited by mere optical data is limited by optical data. We may not transgress into the mysteries of the muck rose and the primrose and see their inner workings within our own and the greater oneness we share with such a limited view. Is Milton's way of seeing also what characterizes our modern usage and understanding of vision? There it is, the Oxford English Dictionary. Tracing the lexical history and semantic evolution of the word vision uncover a deeper and more fundamental meaningness to the word beyond ordinary optics. So there it is, says, the faculty or state of being able to see. Okay, so that we have to pull out some things out of that. What does it mean to see, right? What is a faculty? What is a state? We're in California. I'm in that state. I'm in the being state of California. Okay. So the Oxford English Dictionary lists vision as the state, as the faculty or the state of being able to see, from the Latin videre, meaning to see. So it comes from Latin, a word that means to see in Latin. What then does it mean to see? To perceive an object with the eyes? Here's my paper. To visually recognize something? Consider these English expressions, often used in contemporary discourse. I don't know what you see in him. As I see it, let me see. And I can see right through him. These all refer to seeing inner qualities and characteristics in ourselves or another. They are all immaterial cases of seeing. So for example, as I see it is a phrase totally synonymous with in my opinion. When we want to stop and take a moment to think during a conversation, we often say, let me see, pondering our thoughts to think of the next utterance before we speak again, perhaps even looking up toward the sky for insight. Let me see. We even look up when we do it sometimes. It's interesting. Let's see, and lastly, the expression, I can see right through him is physically impossible. But somehow we are able to see through to the truth of another's, for example, lies and deceptions, or generosity and largesse. And thus we have language that describes speakers' abilities to see these inner realities. Okay. So it is quite clear with regard to these English metaphors that to see or vision has a supernatural function, one that goes beyond the laws of physicality. So a curious progenitor to our modern prototypical understanding of vision dates back actually to Middle English. During the Middle English-speaking era, vision actually denoted a supernatural apparition. That is what a vision was during the Middle English period. And all the same, apparition, that word in Middle English, in late Middle English, that word has its roots in late Middle English having the sense of the action of appearing. And that comes from the Latin word apparere, and that's conjugated with this suffix called parare, which means to come into view. I'm going to just bear with me. I'm just going to read that one more time because I don't have a slide for it, and I make a couple references to Latin and Middle English, and it's helpful. So bear with me. Be a bear. Okay. So our modern understanding of vision dates back to Middle English. During the Middle English-speaking era, vision actually denoted a supernatural apparition, and all the same, apparition with its roots in late Middle English has the sense of the action of appearing. So take note of the word action of appearing. And that actually is from the Latin apparere, which means to come into view. So there's a lot of like activity going on with this seeing. It's definitely not sounding very passive in terms of its historical genealogy, is a word. So the aforementioned may be characterized then by an active, not passive, engaged viewing of the world. And consider also that creativity, poetry, imagination, creativity, what we're talking about, literature, art, creativity, or not, anything. And consider that creativity is not passive, but active by definition. What creation is given to ourselves or the world without the life force of engagement or activity? Right? Thus, in this aspect, vision is essential to creation. So, based on the lexical genealogy of vision mentioned, a definition could be coined as such: a supernatural, active, and engaged viewing of the world. A little different than that. The OED, of course, and then as pertains to creativity, all of that would be essential. That would be an essential modality to creativity. So, of course, the OED lists vision as the faculty of being able to see. So what's faculty? What's that all about? Looking that up presents another worthwhile connection in a historical and comprehensive definition of vision. Faculty is listed as an inherent mental or physical power, from the Latin word facere, which means to make or do. There we go, more activity, more creation. In this sense, vision is active doing, viewing, making, and creating. Vision is inherent. Take note of the preposition, it is inherent. It is essential to our making and doing. Again, it is an essential mode of creation and creativity. Vision thus means to go beyond what we can ordinarily see, to look within as a means to see without or beyond. In the proem of the Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky describes what she refers to as the transmural view. Such a cool word, the transmural view. So take in mind what I've been talking about and this transmural view. So this is from the Secret Doctrine. When a tourist coming from a well-explored country suddenly reaches the borderland of a terra incognita, hedged in and shut out from view from a formidable barrier of impassable rocks, he may still refuse to acknowledge himself baffled in his exploratory plans. Ingress beyond is forbidden, but if he cannot visit the mysterious region personally, he may still find a means of examining it from as short a distance as can be arrived at. Helped by his knowledge of landscapes left behind him, he can get a general and pretty correct idea of the transmural view. If he will only climb to the loftiest summit of the altitudes in front of him. Once there, he can gaze at it at his leisure, comparing that which he dimly perceives with that which he has just left below. Now that he is, thanks to his efforts, beyond the line of the mists and the cloud-capped cliffs. So, it is this way of going beyond sight, via vision, that is integral to Kenneth Morris's three bases of poetry. The first of the three propositions of the Secret Doctrine proposes an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle that is beyond the range and reach of thought. It is unthinkable, it is unspeakable, similar to Morris's first of the three bases of poetry, where the poetic element of vision is discussed in relation to the soul being universal, and poetry being the ground where the larger self speaks through it, the soul. So the theme, the notion, idea, principle of vision, not only characterizes Morris's approach to poetry, but it is the essential aspect of poetic experience yet to be discovered within Chao Shi-hsiung, the aspiring young poet in Morris's short story, The White Bird Inn. Okay, so I'm just going to read a few things from my paper that kind of sort of prepare you for the story. The story is only about 4 pages, 3.5. So it's the main character's discovery of his faculty of vision that actually finally opens his eyes to the realm of poetic experience. We see vision present itself in Morris's story when the young poet has mastered his so-called intellectual faculties and has acquired an encyclopedic knowledge of the eminent Chinese poets, but he has yet to come upon the truth that lies within the experience of poetry itself. So the story begins by introducing the main character, Chao. I'll just call him Chao. I'm not a very good speaker of Chinese. The story begins with Chao and his desire to be a poet. His journey harks towards the mountains, where, if anywhere, he had been told one might learn to write poetry. Consider that from the beginning, Kenneth Morris describes our character to be a poet, rather than merely to write poetry. There is a powerful difference. To be a poet means to embody the very essence of vision, not to compose, but to be composed of, to dissolve into poetry and thus become the object and subject of poetic vision in undisguised sameness. Nevertheless, Morris gives his main character attainability through learning. We may come to the place where poetry resides, in the mountains. We expand our knowledge not under the green lamplight of the library lamp reading the tomes of our intellectual predecessors, but by living amidst the steep mountainside and the great friendly rocks and immemorial wizard pines of our Mother Nature. Despite all that, Chao embarks on a road not too rough for study and goes forward reading the poems of the great Tao Young Ming, reading them. He misses the point by reading poems in a book amidst all this vivid color and nature blossoming with vitality, rather than hearing the wind intoning the kung among the forked and elbowed pine branches above him, and neglecting to feel the reciprocal friendliness for the immense boulders and for the gently darkening blueness of the sky. Chao Shi-sheng walks on the very ground of poetry, but decides to journey upon it while enmeshed in a book of poems. This is similar to the way in which William Blake portrays Newton in his famous painting of the same name as its subject, Newton, seated upon the very mystery he seems to be trying to discover. There he is, right? Walking through the forest, reading from a book of poetry. Well, in his case, absorbed in a diagram. And as you can see, he's seated upon all this very vivid color. It almost looks like a coral reef that you'd find scuba diving, in like the Mediterranean or something. He's arched over. Doesn't look like a very comfortable position to be in. I'm sure when he decides to get up for a break, his back will be in pain. Poor Newton. Poor fake Newton. Okay. So, I'm going to go ahead and read the story. Everyone have a copy? Okay. This is a very ancient tradition, goes back millions and millions of years. So it's reading aloud to people. Just kidding. Bedtime stories. It's perfect. It's evening. You guys are probably, ready for one. So here I am, one reading to you. So the White Bird Inn. Chao Shi-sheng was going up into the mountains, where, if anywhere he had been told, one might learn to write poetry. He was exemplary in diligence and filial conduct, a youth against whom no ill was spoken, kindly and gentle to all. But above everything, he desired to be a poet. It was coming to be evening. He had left the flat rice fields at midday, and now was among the rocks and pines. Behind and far below lay the fields, and beyond them the city. Beyond that again, gleaming in faint pearl and turquoise and silver, the southern sea. On either side rose the steep mountainside, great, friendly rocks and immemorial wizard pines. The road was not too rough for study, and Chao Shi-sheng went forward reading the poems of the great Tao Young Ming. He heard not the wind intoning the kung among the forked and elbowed pine branches above him. He saw no wizardry in the tufts of the pine needles. He neglected to feel a reciprocal friendliness for the immense boulders and for the gently darkening blueness of the sky. The world acclaims Tao Yongming, the first poet of the age, said Chao. Yet even from him I learn not the secret. I perceive his method of arranging the four tones and have succeeded in arranging them in like manner in my own efforts. I take note of the subjects he writes upon and have written on them often myself. Further, I have studied carefully the Book of Odes and the poetry of the period of Han, and I have practiced benevolence and made some progress. Yet my effusions cause no enthusiasm even in myself. Although young, his attainments were very great. All that study could make them. He had obtained his Qi Shi degree and was employed as lecturer on poetry at the university in his native city. His dissertations were marked by subtleness and extreme learning. Yet none of his pupils became poets. He preserved his modesty, realizing his own deficiencies. One day he noticed a stranger in the lecture hall, an old man dressed uncouthly with a very long beard, very bright eyes, and a dignified and mysterious demeanor. Chao Shixing was expounding that morning the elegies of Chu Yung. A certain inspiration and unwanted eloquence came upon him, and he felt he was nearer to the secret of poetry than he ever had been before. The bright eyes of the stranger seemed to awaken wonderful but dim memories within him, so that he was filled with new hope. At the close of the lecture, the stranger came to him. Chao Shixing smiled and bowed, feeling that he owed much to this old man's friendly encouragement. "Sir," said the stranger, "why do you waste your life in these idle strivings? Following this path, you will never become a poet." "I have studied diligently," said Chao. "Unfortunately, genius is lacking." "Genius is not lacking, but unawakened," said the other. "Forgo your flashy methods and seek quietude. Quit your book learning, sir. Follow the gulls into cloudland, and do not bury your ethereal self beneath the dust of the world. Take the Empyrean for your roof, the sun and the moon for your constant companions, and the four seas for your inseparable friends. Study the magic of the mountains, sir, and your laudable ambitions will be fulfilled." So now Chao Shixing was endeavoring to take his advice. He came to the head of the pass. The world was all behind him now, and before and on all sides, the realm of mountain magic. Beyond the valley in front rose dim and darkly glowing mountains, forest-clad and afar, like faint petals of a lily against the sapphire sky. The snow peaks shadowed with the sunset in pale rose and salmon and blue. In the depths of the valley, the river sang and gleamed, a narrow, winding thread of silver, broken here and there where it was hidden by trees. The road ran among the pines. The stars were beginning to shine. The spinning maiden and the cowherd shone out bright, watching each other across the impassable river of stars. It became too dark to read, and Chao Shixing closed his book and looked out over the mountain world, and then at last forgot his old strivings and desires. All at once he heard lute music and singing lovelier than any singing he had heard in his life. "It will be from some inn," he thought he, and remembered that he was tired and hungry, and that an inn where he might sup and sleep would be the most desirable thing he could come upon. In a little while he came to it. The hostess bade him welcome and fetched him warm wine and food. While she waited on him, she went on singing. He watched her by the light of the lanterns that hung from the rafters. She was clad in gleaming white, pale blue flowers were in her black hair, and her long sleeves were rimmed with blue. Her eyes were bright and quick like a bird's, and her motions as she ran and tripped, he thought, were bird-like. And her singing was sweet, 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 rising and trilling and flowing now and now soft cooing, deep and mysterious. At one moment she was in the room serving him, at the next she had run out, sleeves rustling and fluttering, and her singing came from the right, from the left, from above. Peace and delight and mountain sweetness flowed over his soul, and he sat and listened and listened. The night deepened. The moon rose over the snow peaks, the waters of the river below. The wind among the pine branches, the murmur of pine needles overhead seemed a part of her song. He listened, and all the music became one. He heard the mountain voices intone the great Kung. This is wonderful, thought he. Then remembrance of the poems of the Tao Yung Ming came upon him, partly through his old habit of study, partly through an unwanted awakening in his soul. He opened his book and began reading, and at that very moment he heard that the hostess was singing the very poem on which his eyes rested. He read and listened as she sang. But now the characters on the page were alive, they were moving and shining, the mountain magic had possessed them. They sang themselves with her singing. The poem was glowing and souled. In every ideogram, he heard the hostess' voice. He beheld a light like a diamond, like a pearl, like a twinkling opal. And from each he heard the call of the far waters, the voice of the night birds in the valley, the long sough and whisper of the wind among the pines. The printed poem itself was intoning with them, the Kung. Chao Shisheng marveled quietly, half dreaming. "This is poetry," said he. The hostess sang on. The wind came wandering up out of the valley, bearing the scents of the southern night. Chao Shisheng heard the wheel of the spinning maiden in the sky, far and sweet, and he heard her song, and the answering song of the cowherd from beyond the river of stars that neither of them may pass. He heard the river of stars sing as it flowed through the blue plains of infinity, and the stars and the wind and the pines and the faintly glistening petals of the snow peaks and the hostess with her lute. And the waters of the valley below had one voice, it seemed, between them. They were chanting the poems of Tao Yung Ming. They were all intoning the Kung. All night long, Chao Shisheng listened, forgetting everything. Forgetting everything in deep oblivion of desires for the wonder of the great Kung that he heard. All night long, the hostess of the White Bird Inn was singing. It was getting cold, it seemed to him. Was it the poems of the Tao Yung Ming she was singing now? Or was she imitating marvelously the voice of a bird, surging in rich trills, gurgling like deep, lonely waters, flowing forth, rising and falling? Sweet, sweet, sweet. Could every human voice be so bird-like? It was cold, and his limbs and body were stiff. He opened his eyes. The rafters overhead were strangely like the living branches of a pine, forked and twisted, and with many elbows. He sat up. The inn. There was no inn. He had been lying on the ground beneath a pine tree just off the road, and no bed under him but the fallen dry needles. The snow peaks afar were beginning to grow pale and saffron, faint blue and silver and salmon color, with the rising of the sun. The song came from the branches above him. Decidedly, there were no human words to it, not even the magical words of the Tao Yung Ming. He looked up, and there on a twig above his head, a white bird was singing. She had a little blue tuft of feathers on her head, and the white gleaming wings of her were blue-tipped. And she was singing, 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 and in her song, Chao Shisheng heard all joy and all sorrow, and that which is beyond sorrow and joy. He heard the deep, far murmur, the eternal mystery of the Kung. Then he went on his way, chanting the poems of Tao Yung Ming, and poems, yes, poems of his own. Into all of them he chanted the same lonely, solemn, joyous, infinite wonder and tone. The pines rustling above seemed to have human expression. The boulders looked at him kindly and human-wise, and he reciprocated the friendliness. He was a great poet after that, it is said. Thank you, Kenneth Morris. So, I just have a short conclusion, and then we can chat a bit if you like. So Morris declares that poetry is something that is never personal. In theosophical language, all individual souls are part of this greater oversoul. We are thus in constant embrace amidst a universal encompassment and never personal. In this way, the self is not separate. It is inextricably linked to the universal oneness and thus expansive and limitless, not distinct from an infinite cosmic awareness where I is one and only, but rather I, you, and it, and hence all is dynamic singularity. This tripartite mystery expresses itself when the all-encompassing mode of seeing, vision, expresses its greater view beyond the personal differentiated self. A larger self speaks through it, according to Morris. So part one of his three braces is appropriately titled Vision 1, the beginnings. Poetics begins with vision, not meter, form, or some other formalism often determined by some modern poetry doctrinaires. To be a poet is to fathom beyond ordinary limits, to encompass the world within oneself through the world itself. Poetry is an embodied act, rather than simply an exercise in composition. If poetry is mystical, we are composed of poetry, as are the mountains and trees, and in concert, the enigma of poetry plays its music through our ability to see, not only by using our optical faculties, but through our spiritually endowed long-range transmural view. Once we have the insight that our poetic compositions are missing the element of experience, we may then begin to see that we ourselves are composed of the very thing we are attempting to capture through verse, or in Newton's case, through diagrams. It is upon this realization that we may then let go and begin to write poetry. So that's pretty much exactly what happens to our friend, listen to me. Our friend Chow, he's a big friend now. He's a great poet. So let's see here. Why don't we go backwards a bit? Again. Forwards, backwards. There we go, right there. Okay. Backwards, forwards, it's all the same. Upwards, downwards. Okay, where are we? Where are you? Okay, so these images on the side here, these are drawings by Machel, and these were actually the drawings that were in the short story, The Whitebird Inn. And I've just extracted a couple quotes that I particularly like, and I felt kind of look nice next to those pictures. And might be something interesting to spark discussion if we want to. So why don't we just go through all three of them and take some time to read by yourself? And then if any thoughts come to mind, just thought it out. Next one. Okay. Maybe another one. What's the kung? I really like how quiet it is in here right now. Okay. So, yeah, sorry, what? Mm. I was hoping somebody, I was like not going to talk about it because I was hoping somebody to go, oh, Kung, I know what that is. Oh, please, I didn't hear what you said because of the microphone.
I said that the Kung is the ode to life. I don't know if ode is a good word.
I think it's a great word because it's musical,
All right.
right? The Kung is from what I understand, it's technically speaking, it's the F tone. It's the F tone note. It's middle F above middle C on the piano, and it has been referred to as the tonic of nature. So in the story, it talks a lot about the tone and the sound of the river, the mountain, well, the pine trees, the pine needles, sort of whistling in the wind, and people who are interested in relating the Kung or the F tone into sort of modern sounds, like city sounds, you can even, I think it's been said that you can identify that sound in the sound of traffic. Makes me think of John Cage, who loved the sound of traffic. Talk about vision, right? So if that's, it's interesting because if our environment, actually, if you can identify or you can hear, you can perceive a tone or a sound in our environment, and a tone and music we often like to associate with poetry and creativity. Well, then what better place to go to learn poetry rather than a classroom than there, right? Where the Kung is totally pervasive and expansive in its surrounds. So, right here, it's Chao Shisheng was going up into the mountains where, if anywhere, he had been told one might learn to write poetry. Maybe look at another slide, unless anybody has any other thoughts.
Are those drawings done by Mitchell or Morris? Is Mitchell?
Mitchell did those drawings.
And he was who?
Oh, okay. So Mitchell, I think, did like a lot of the carvings in Point Loma.
Okay.
And he also did a lot of the drawings for Kenneth Morris. And all kind, like when Ben was speaking earlier, all those except for maybe a few of them, the ones with the typewriter typeface. Mm-hmm. If you noticed, the ones where it has like almost looks like it was done with crayon, kind of. Mm-hmm. Those were Kenneth Morris, which is so lovely because it has this very youthful, child-like sort of imagery to it.
Very beautiful.
Yeah.
Yes, anything that gives us the more universal picture. And again, I think nature, because it reflects like it was written here, giving the beauty of the universe, which is really the big picture. As beautiful as humans have made different parts of this globe with buildings, etc., it does not rival with the universe. And anything that really gives you this larger picture, the more universal picture, is more wise, as was said by Blavatsky and
Richard,
others.
can you speak in the mic?
I will. I hope. Would be more wise when you have, again, the more universal picture. And on this earth, I don't think there's anything more beautiful than the natural aspects to bring this out, to give you this picture. So I can see the thought that's being trying to be explained here, and I think there's some truth to that.
I think also a lot of times when you ask people, "Oh, are you creative?" They go, "Oh, no, I'm not creative." And then I'll say, okay, well, will you imagine a zebra drinking a glass of milk? And then they do it. And they're like, I'm like, okay, you have an imagination. There it is. Bam. Anybody can do that. You know, anybody can do that. Maybe some people can see it more than others or not, but everybody can create an impression of a zebra drinking a glass of milk. So maybe not everybody is, you know, inclined to be able to write such beautiful verse or poetry like Kenneth Morris, but nonetheless, we don't have to write poetry. In this case, that is Kenneth Morris's like mode, in a way. He's a poet, right? And he likes to write poetry, but we don't have to write it. You know, we can just go for a walk. And when you sort of lose when the sort of duality between the leaf, you know, and the Riain sort of dissolve, you know? I mean, that's a really hard thing to talk about, right? That's why poetry is so great. Poetry is totally illogical. You can say things like, a zebra was drinking a glass of milk and flew across the sky. The sky tore up into pieces, and blue jeans became very popular. It's like, it doesn't make any sense, and I just made it up. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that poetry is really, really not a logical, intellectual, per se kind of thing. So, you know, you don't have to write poetry to experience poetry. You just have to be able to, not be able to do anything, I guess, but I think that's what's being purported here, is for people to go into the mountains, to learn, to experience what you're saying is the sort of universe, the greater impersonal poet. He says poetry is not personal. That doesn't mean writing poetry only. Yes, Yoke.
When words like this come from Kenneth Morris, you always have to take into account that by going up the mountain, you have the same picture as the biblical Sermon on the Mount, and that is going higher within yourself. And I think he also means to show us that.
Mm. You know, let me see. I don't remember where I read this, but it was in something Japanese I read it in. And it says, the reason why you want to climb a mountain is because you are the mountain. So if you realize that you're the mountain, you don't really need to climb it.
Many Buddhistic sutras starts also with Buddha is going up to the mountain. Yeah, going. And in the Gospels you find it as well. Yeah. But I had to make another thing, is that what sounds very nice to me in this is that with very simple words and repeat the particular words, he is able to sketch a very good dimension of what the surrounding is. By they say that behind, far below, beyond them, beyond that again. You see what I try to say?
Oh, of course, yeah.
And it is just repeating, and there is, let's say, it's not very complicated words, even for not English people. But the image you get by it is very good.
I think why that's so lovely is because so much of the world is characterized by repetition, or i.e. motion. You know, motion is what makes the world go around. So when you do this, you're sort of creating motion through very mundane words like behind and a conjunctive, you know, and, you know, a determiner. These are really boring kind of terms for these words. So behind and far below lay the fields, and beyond them the city, and beyond that again. So it's this wonderful depiction through words, the motion of life, I think.
What Herman just say, I think I can find myself in those words. Isn't it so that the meaning of this is the journey that the person is making within himself, as Herman said, climbing the mountain, and seeing all those things within himself, and then wake up?
just as it might be hard to remember, but when I read the passage from Milton, that's exactly what Kenneth Morris sees in Milton. He sees an identification of humanity in, you know, the way the flower is behaving. So he never mentions a person or anything human. He's talking about, you know, the way the flower is sort of wilting. And we sometimes say, oh, look at her wilting over there in the corner. You know, we even borrow the words we describe for plants and apply them to people. So yeah, I think Kenneth Morris likes that about Milton very much.
To add one last piece to it, also I think this is very much symbolical, like in symbolical language. It's a poem, but in symbolical language, not to take it very literally.
Yeah, however, I feel like it's definitely symbolic indeed, like we were talking about the mountain, which is interesting because we write about like a lot of the world's literatures will symbolically use the mountain as a way to talk about something other. But the mountain is something that is real as well. It is literally, you can see it with your optical relationship, but you can also see it not just with the OED's definition, but you can see it. So that's the sort of literal scene, and then related to the, you know, Kenneth Morris's mode of vision, which is this sort of supernatural, literally supernatural.
I really liked the way you explained the word vision, which is also the subject of your talk. Also having an active part in it, and also a very an inner meaning. It's also a lot about. I think there's always a lot of wisdom in sayings, also like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, things like that. And but for me also vision. I don't know if it's the same in English, but if you talk about people with vision, it's a lot more ideas, or also ideas that can inspire. So it's really also something inner, some inner meaning, and it's, I think, also it's more about a states of consciousness also. So you also have. We translate buddhi, for instance, the principle also with insight, and there you also have this seeing sight. And I was wondering if you look at the meaning of vision that way, what is the vision from Kenneth Morris you've discovered in this piece, in this story you've chosen? What did you think about his vision?
I think that was wonderful. First of all, I will answer that question. So notice how he used the word insight. Sight. Insight. And then you said it's related. People who have vision, we talk about ideas. So, but we're using the word vision to talk about ideas. And then you talk about how it's related to sort of, vision is sort of an inspiration, I think you use that word. Inspiration for ideas. And then inspiration comes from the Latin word inspirare, which means to breathe life into. So I think that is exactly what happens to our character. It's easy to say, oh, I was so inspired by that movie, and then you go out and buy a hamburger at McDonald's. It's like, what? You know, it's easy to talk about inspiration, but to really experience inspiration is, I don't know how to talk about that either. But I think that's what happens to our character, is that before he's studying poetry, he's studying all the great eminent Chinese poets, and he loves poetry and he admires it, and he probably, you know, he's a very kind of noble and sincere, you know, desire to go further. and he knows he hasn't gotten there, which is cool. It's just nice that he notices it. And then by the end of the story, he becomes inspired. The life is breathed into him by sort of closing the book and just taking a walk. That's all he does. He's inspired, for real. With vision, thank you, Ken. He's inspired with vision, so yeah, that's...
It is a magnificent piece of work. It's my opinion anyway. But again, the symbolism which I might throw out, the white bird, I think it might be a symbol for the higher self, if you will. The Lufthansa, the Hansa, the swan, has been written in various places, if I can't remember where, as being another aspect of the higher self or the spiritual or divine. I see that this is what really sang to him and gave him the feeling of an end. It's, of course, very symbolic and not objective, as you say. You can use your imagination. But I get that particular impression. That's my own interpretation, which is worth whatever.
Well, that's what happens at the end. All that's making all that singing is a white bird. And I think what the thing that you refer to as what the symbol relates to is what is singing to him. You know, something, you know, higher, I suppose. And then in terms of the symbols that he does use, I mean, Kenneth Morris is so detailed. Like, every single thing in there is so precise. You could probably read this a lot and always find new things, you know.
Okay, that it? All right. Looking at it again and again, I was first struck how it reminds me of the voice of the silence when she uses sound. You know, the twinkle, but it's all sound. This says the same thing in color. It creates the same energy within that Blavatsky uses in the voice with sound, the twinkling and the sounds. Very delicate, very delicate.
And she refers to the Kung in that very same work. So it's, and Kenneth Morris does too, of course. Did you want to say something, cameraman?
Thank you. My name is Marina.
Microphone man.
Yeah. A microphone man. Now that's cool. First of all, I thought that nighttime stories were supposed to put you to sleep. This one wakes you up, doesn't it? I think it was Oscar Wilde who said that by experiencing beauty, you get to the best in yourself. Could you put the slide on with the picture of William Blake?
Newton. I'm just...
And now everything is gone.
That's the transmural view.
Yeah. Yeah, I like this very much. I think it's very beautiful, and I think it's not just about experiencing nature, but it's. I was really reminded of your talk before, Monica. You know, it's if you stand still and you take your time, you know, you start seeing different things. So for me, our new Chinese friend was studying with the head in the beginning, and he started studying with the heart afterwards, and he started seeing very different things. I think it's very beautiful, and I like the poem so much because, yeah, you can read it again and again, and it will bring out that which is important. So thank you for sharing this with us.
And when he opens the book again, the words intone the Kung. So he goes back to his head. And when he goes back to it, his head's finally alive.
Riain, I'm not a poet, but I saw in this story an initiation. Say it good?
Sorry?
Inviting? I saw in this story an initiation.
Initiation.
Yes. Because I saw a man, he wanted the truth. Not the truth how I write poetry, but the truth of life. And he climbs up the mountain, and that is what I explained Joke and Herman all before. And I think when he was ready when he was, yes, the look he had of the world was gone. He was sleeping, but you can also say he has sophisticated things throwing overboard, and he was ready to get an initiation. And he saw, you can say, a part of nirvana, how the things are connected. And I think that is what the white bird will tell us. That's my impression of this.
Thank you, Flip. The initiation begins where in the story, do you remember? When does he, I mean, it's debatable, but I mean, something comes to mind, a particular point where the initiation begins.
It's on. When the old man comes in, the initiation begins. It's the initiation, after all. And
right.
It's the Hierophant takes him through it.
Yeah. Yes.
What do you think?
That's what I thought. Yeah.
And I think. Yeah, I think that he was seeking for the answer. He was seeking for the answer. How much of his experience he created? I don't know how we can find that out, but it's okay to say that I understand that when a shock happened, like when somebody told him maybe you do have the kung, but you're covering it with the dust of the world.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take the dust away. You can do it. Good. It was the push. I understand. Do you want to add more on that? I wanted to say something else.
Please do.
I wanted to say that. Can you please go to that slide where he listens? Right there. Okay, so after he listens, he feels. After he listens, he encounters the white bird. Or the bird serves him and sings to him and inspires. It's incredible the amount of service that he receives just because he sat and listened, and then he becomes he feels the friendliness. I love that. So in the moment when you listen, like Marino said, you have a gift that is 10 million times bigger than what you offered. You actually haven't done anything but melted. You just sit there waiting, and the gifts are coming for you. So that I thought that's cool.
Very nice, yeah. And I think with regard to the definition of vision, I discuss as an engaged and active, scene of the world, not a passive. This would be where listening is not passive. It's not when, someone's talking with you and you're like, you're not really listening. It's when you're hearing things, but you don't hear them. You're not engaged. Your listening isn't engaged. So I think that's the situation where he's just doing something very simple, like sitting there, but his listening is now engaged. He hears. It's an active, engaged listening in accordance with his active, engaged vision.
Riain, you talked about vision, and in the whole story there's much of music. And the third aspect I forgot. What was the third one?
Style.
Style? No, that's for another convivium. But perhaps you can do the other two another time, for it is such an interesting subject for us all, for we don't learn so much about poetry. This is the first time in all our conventions that we hear about poetry, so please, music and style next time. Yes? La la!
Also, please bring this back with you again tomorrow. This will be part of what I'm talking about tomorrow as well. But it'd be kind of homework too. So.
Oh, these poems, not yours. More poems? Yeah. Okay. So this is the book that was shown earlier. This has most of his. So many. Yeah, all of them. All his short stories, and then his poetry is sort of scattered around. But I think there's a. What is the Tales of the Dragon Pattern? Nothing. That's no. Oh yeah, that's right. He has translations of Chinese poetry, but his own poetry, yeah, it's not. I mean, Ken, would you be able to help out with that?
Kenneth Morris's poetry is throughout the issues of the Theosophical Path, for example. Literally in almost every issue, somewhere there's something. There's his 3 bases of poetry, where Riain has just talked about the vision part, makes it perhaps seem like it may be a short document. It's over 100 pages long. So each section of vision, music, and style are like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. He goes into depth, in those areas. He also wrote a shorter, it was referred to in the other reading from Douglas Anderson, it's called The Dual Nature of Man in Free Verse and Poetry. That's also in the Theosophical Path. So with all of that, there's quite a lot of insight into the nature of poetry in relationship to our theosophical views. There are some collections, but nothing's ever been published in terms of his collected poetry.
Shall we?
Riain, one thing, I cannot take another year. Can you say a little bit about music? Because I just come with the example of the simple words. Can you say that the rhythm or the music in that simple words, what we have seen as this example, is a very important thing? You see what I'm trying to say?
Oh, yeah,
or
sure.
say it in other words, how far was music playing an effect in this simple word?
It's a very good question. I think there's a lot of ways to answer it. First thing that comes to mind is, the words themselves, as printed on the, it's funny, when you think about a word, a lot of times you can think of it as a word printed on the page, or it's a word that you speak. And when does speech, which is sound, stop being music, and when is it music? I think conventionally speaking, it's when I start going, it's musical, I'm singing, Forgive me for singing. So I think all words, every single word, be it a preposition or a word like, illuminate, is musical. And so I think it requires, when Ben was reading Mr. Anderson's paper, he talks about how Kenneth Morris was he was very musical. He liked to read poetry. He was able to have the vision, and the listening with the words to embody the music in them and speak and read them. And that's actually, poetry is an oral tradition. It is musical. It is forgotten that music is sort of pre-literate. So it's musical.
In the other reading that was done, I think the word Kenneth Morris used, I don't know what that word would be in Dutch, is that for him poetry was incantation. Incantation, like essentially in Eastern tradition we would say poetry is mantra. Mantra means incantation, so that the value is as much in the the consciousness sound value, toned incantation, is as important as the so-called content meaning, or more important perhaps.
It'd be interesting to know the Webster's dictionary definition of music.
Muse. I think it comes from the word muse, which is, of course, this person that comes down and like helps us be creative. I don't know much about it. I mean, in terms of how far past how far musical goes beyond muse, because I actually have looked it up, and it's pretty bare. You don't get much more than just muse, you know, as a related.
Perhaps Eldon, if you could look that up through your whatever iPad and see what it says. If we got the time, I don't want to hold anybody up. But Eldon's got all the music. Oh, okay, sorry. I don't know if anybody else has it. If you're just curious, I don't know. I'm just curious to know what it is.
Sure, certainly.
But Brian, the Muses are the daughters of Apollo, the sun. They're not silly ladies coming along.
I didn't say they were silly ladies. Did it sound like I did?
No, they are the daughters, the products of the influence of the sun.
Indeed.
Yes, and that is quite a lot if you can hear those birds.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Jukka, for adding that, because I think I was speaking from a sort of like very modern conventional definition of how kind of most people, you know, oh, the muse, you know, we think of it as this. It's like, oh, I've been trying to write this song for weeks, and suddenly the muse came. It's an expression that it's in everybody's lexicon, I think, but I think that's certainly the like sort of deeper connection to that, like that we forget, just like sort of all of the etymological history of words like vision and faculty and see and things.
You know the Homer poets, the two, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the Odyssey starts when Odysseus asks the muse to inspire him to write the whole Odyssey. And it's one of the anchors of our Western mythical and mystical society. So asking for inspiration from the muses is much more than a song in Hollywood. Excuse me.
Indeed.
The start of this Whitebird Inn and the top of it, the introduction, the last three sentences, it said, in it Morris gently suggests for the first time one of his favorite themes that book learning is not an adequate substitute for the experience of life. So maybe something to think about while you're reviewing this?
Certainly, I think that's exactly what this story captures, is that Chow pursues book learning for much of his time as a poet. And it's when he sort of temporarily abandons book learning that he experiences life, not through a book, but through content, you know, living content. Yeah.
So we looked up music, or I should say Monica did. The word music comes from the Greek, musica, by the way of Latin musica. It ultimately is derived from mosa, the Greek word for muse.
There you go, can't go further than a muse.
So the arts, it's another name for art. The muses dealt with the arts, right? It was basically art, so it is consistent in what you just said. It doesn't have to be the instruments and all that.
And Kenneth Morris is showing this is essentially vision, muse and vision. Yeah.
I have a quick thing I can read that I wrote about that I didn't mention in here. This is actually from Kenneth Morris. He says, music, no less than vision, is an essential of poetry. because poetry is the pressure of the soul upon words, and the soul lives in a world of music. So if the soul lives in a world of music, the soul thus is embedded in music. Its environment is musical. Hence, the poetry that emerges by means of the soul and its musical world contains the very element of music and is vital to the poetry itself. So vision is essential to music in terms of having the insight to be able to access and embody poetry. So in order to hear music, we must be able to see its instruments. In other words, the mountains, the stream, and the trees.
Okay, Riain. I'd like to thank you very much for your lessons. And beyond that, it was very inspiring. And beyond that, again, we need time to digest this information.